Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Weiss. I'm Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, D.C. It's a real pleasure to welcome everyone who's joining us via YouTube and watching on Carnegie's website or on social media. We have a great session now with Kathryn Belton. Kathryn is the author of a book which has just come out in the United States and the United Kingdom entitled Putin's People: How the KGB Took Back Russia and Then Took on the West. Kathryn spent approximately 14 years living in Moscow, working as a correspondent for the Moscow Times, Business Week, and then for the Financial Times. She's now an investigative reporter at Reuters based in London. Kathryn, it's so great to see you. Thanks for doing this today. Congratulations on the book.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to chat to you about it. Thank you.
No, it's really been exciting, and I've followed your reporting for many years. I've followed your development of this book and the ideas in the book, and it's really exciting now that it's finally out. So congratulations, everyone. I hope has seen the reviews, particularly in the UK, where the reviews have been extremely positive. And I wanted to ask, maybe if you could just sort of set the scene for a few moments and sort of give us a sense of the scope of the book. You've really taken a very long look at Putin's rise, and then sort of what was I always thought was fun about the title of the book, Putin's People, which is obviously a nod to the Jean Le Carré Smiley's people. When we first talked about the book, you were talking about the individuals and the sort of the entourage and the coterie. The topic of the book, I think, seems to have expanded in the writing, which is one of those things that happens. But maybe if you could explain to folks what the book's about, and then I've got some questions to raise. But welcome. Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I did start working on the book a very long time ago when I was still basically with the FT in Moscow. Then I did have sort of great privileged opportunity to speak and get to know many of the oligarchs around Putin and in Russian business then, including the metals tycoons. There were senior bankers I could speak to, and sort of former and current Kremlin officials. And it really seemed to me that I'd had a very privileged position. And also in the years of the Medvedev presidency, we also had a lot more access than journalists presumably have today. So I really felt that there was an opportunity to really delve more into who these people were around Putin and really answer the question of things that we didn't really seem to understand yet, of how it was Putin came to power, what happened to the security services at the Soviet fall. There are all these questions that it seemed to me that we didn't really understand. Most of what we know about Putin is from his own very carefully curated account that was given on the eve of his rise to the presidency. Or we know things from people who travel often to the West, but many of them are beholden to Putin and sort of help craft a certain narrative. So I really wanted to be able to take time to sort of jump back from the day-to-day reporting when we only sort of get to scratch the surface most of the time, and just really take a very long dive into sort of Putin's men and what they were really about. And some of the themes of the book actually first appeared and sort of was in Masha Gessen's very excellent book, The Man Without a Face. I was inspired by some of her reporting then. Sort of she raised questions, for instance, I think she'd spoken to Bakhtin, the former interior minister who'd taken over the KGB immediately after the Soviet fall, and he'd been explaining how it was impossible for him to get his arms around and grasp what was going on within the KGB's active reserve, this cadre of officers who served the KGB but actually were kind of undercover in positions of state power and elsewhere, that he just couldn't really understand them. And she also cited Leningrad or St. Petersburg member of parliament who led an investigation into one of the early scandals of Putin's career in St. Petersburg, the oil for food scheme, and her doubts about what had really happened in the August 91 coup and why it was that power had passed so peacefully from Gorbachev to Yeltsin without really any bloodshed, had the KGB essentially assisted in that. So these were all kind of questions that I was trying to grasp and sort of grapple with when trying to understand Putin, where he came from, how he came to power, and what the security men around him were about. And I had several strokes of luck. I'd known for a while a former chairman of Kroll who'd been involved in an investigation into what happened to the Communist Party wealth at the Soviet fall. And he told me, for instance, that it was clear that sort of members of the foreign intelligence arm had been moving assets out of the country, mostly through commodities deals into foreign bank accounts and offshore companies. And that they've been clearly sort of trying to preserve some remnants of networks ahead of the Soviet fall that they've been preparing. And he also pointed me in the direction of another former KGB operative who happened to work at a small Swiss bank in Lugano. And he turned out to be somebody who'd worked with Putin on the oil for food deals in the early 90s in St. Petersburg. And of course, everyone will remember this scandal. Putin had handed out a bunch of licenses to a bunch of crony companies to trade commodities and raw materials in exchange for food that was so vitally needed by St. Petersburg in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet fall. Prices had been freed overnight, supply chains had broken down, the city really needed food, but the companies that had landed the licenses, like millions and millions of dollars worth, had essentially kind of run away with the proceeds, and it was seen as an early example of Putin's kleptocracy, that he was helping his friends and allies line their pockets out of some kind of inside deal. But actually the story the former KGB operative had to tell was a bit different. His name was Filipe Turova, and he told of a story in which these schemes, this barter scheme, had been set up as a way to pay off debts owed to intermediaries known as friendly firms, which had been key in funding influence operations during the Soviet era. What they would do would be supply equipment to the Soviet Union and for infrastructure at vastly inflated prices, and they would pocket the difference and then use the profits to fund influence operations or Communist Party operations. And he said we had to find a channel through which we could do this secretly, and the barter scheme was one way of doing that. And these barter schemes were going on across Russia on a federal scale. The one we know about Putin being involved in is only one small example. And he also basically described it in a way that they were creating a slush fund for the city. Russia had then pronounced itself bankrupt, so any official foreign bank accounts would have been frozen. There was a moratorium on paying debts. So they had to find an unofficial way to have foreign bank accounts so that they could pay whoever they wanted to, also for the city, but also because it wasn't transparent, they could dip into it anytime they wanted, whether it's pay for hotels or travel themselves. So it was a slush fund. And the way this kind of scheme operated became, I think, very much a model on how Putin runs the economy today. He has a network of allies who have access to insider deals. No one's really able to have any oversight over what they do. And there's sort of slush funds on a mass scale in which Putin and his men are able to dip into whenever they want for their personal needs, but also are kept for strategic purposes. So it was just an interesting way to look at sort of how Putin and his men worked, and it sort of became apparent also during the reporting. I was able to speak to sort of former KGB allies of Putin from St. Petersburg, such as Vladimir Putin and others, that really the sort of the former KGB men sort of had very much remained in the background as a force throughout the 90s in the shadows, of course. But it was the case that it wasn't the case that the KGB had simply downed weapons and given up, but they were sort of retreated in the background. They were biding their time, and indeed their moment did come in the August 98 financial collapse, when Putin was the representative who was able to emerge and rise quite rapidly through the Kremlin ranks, and indeed through some say accident, some say political calculation. I think it was a mixture of both, but he was certainly able to become the former KGB man who took power. And as one former senior US official has said, that if it wasn't Putin, it would have been somebody else like him, that the security services were still a force to be reckoned with, and they were taking over power. So really what we see today in many ways, I think, is very representative of that. Some people, some analysts have said that my book focuses perhaps a bit too much on the security services, but I think there's been a sort of, in some Western analysis, there's been kind of perhaps not enough scrutiny of their activities, and maybe I've overcompensated a bit, but I also think it's time, because I think the West as well, we didn't really have a real clear vision into what was going on into the security services in the final years before the Soviet collapse, and in the early 90s indeed, because the Russians had Aldrich Ames in the CIA, who was blowing most Western intelligence agents within the security services in Russia. And so there wasn't much insight into what was going on. And I do think it's the case that increasingly and ever more the security men around Putin are very much dominate politics, and indeed sort of Putin is in many ways their front man. Very often they'll make decisions collectively. Of course, there are technocrats in the Kremlin, but unfortunately, as we've seen with the recent takeover of Vedomosti, the business newspaper, their voices are kind of drowned out. Perhaps they might be more pragmatic, more progressive, but now we see a very clear vector in terms of trying to make sure that Putin and his men retain power, and that seems to be the prevailing kind of vector that we see. And also they've been key, it's been very clear that they've been key in determining foreign policy, that sort of the security men that I've spoken to around Putin and allies associated with them have been sort of quite clear that from the get-go, the game was to try and restore Russia as a great global power. Indeed, they believed that sort of Russia was entitled to be a great global player, even after the fall of the Soviet Union, because of all the great sacrifices of World War II and so on. And that sort of the moment Putin came to power and was beginning to stabilize the situation, the West should be more open to hearing Russia's concerns, that it should treat it as an equal player and not just as a weak economic basket case. But unfortunately, as we've seen, the security men in charge of the Kremlin don't have the toolkit to rebuild Russia's economy to make it a great global player by having a strong domestic economy. But what they can do very well is try and leverage weaknesses in other countries to kind of create division, well, not create, so kind of exacerbate divisions in other Western countries, so they can cause trouble elsewhere, while sort of doing everything they can to take over strategic cash flows, shore up their own power, and then project their influence abroad. And I guess that's where we are at the current juncture. And it was a fascinating and wonderful opportunity to be able to research this so well and maintain contact with sources that I built while I was at the FT, who would come to London and perhaps be a little bit more open about talking about things in London than they might have been in Moscow. So that, in short, is why it took me so long to report, because it was fascinating. But thank you.
No, thanks, Kathryn, for that overview. So let's start by saying, first of all, that anyone who's watching this on YouTube, I'd invite your input and questions, and I'll funnel those are going to be funneled into me, and I'll then pass them along to Kathryn. So please start commenting and coming up with questions, and we'll get to them in the course of this conversation. Let's talk about Putin himself, and I'll just stipulate that, you know, having worked on Russia for a long time, the longer I work on it, the less confident I am in my views on things, and that I think that the ability to actually say something is factual, or that, you know, an assessment is grounded in reality, I'm increasingly less confident of my ability to do that. But let's talk about his career for a moment. My understanding from reading the book, and I don't want to overly simplify this, is that you seem to think that he was a more formidable representative of the security establishment, and that his career, particularly in the Soviet KGB in East Germany, had more meaning and potential more sensitive assignments than is commonly understood. And I'm just going to ask you if you could talk a little bit about how you came to that conclusion, because the conventional reading, which I tend to myself find very compelling, is his career wasn't impressive, and he did not have a good run as a KGB officer. He actually never really got into the top cohort of important people, and then was washed out even before the Soviet collapse. But the book is sort of more revisionist in that respect. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would agree that he wasn't in the top cohort for sure, but I think they've taken great efforts really to play down what he actually was doing in Dresden. He's spoken himself about the sort of mass destruction of documents, about what the KGB was up to in Dresden. That's confirmed by people who work in the Stasi archives. They say, look, we have very little visibility of what they were actually doing, because they either shipped all the documents out or they set fire to them. And there's been sort of this kind of great effort also on Putin's part when he wrote he gave a series of interviews on the eve of his rise to the presidency, in which he too sort of stressed how minor his role was. But he also happened to dismiss some early reports about whether he was a key link with Hans Modrow, who was the local Communist Party leader in Dresden, who indeed had been picked by the Soviets to take over from Honecker. They wanted Modrow to lead East Germany through perestroika type era reforms, but Putin was very quick to dismiss that. He said, no, of course I'm not. I was never any kind of super agent. Indeed, my activity there was transparent for all to see. You can see what I did in archives, forgetting, of course, to mention that it's not transparent to see in the archives that in fact they destroyed everything. But in the tiny fragments of papers that do remain, in one document, he is indeed named as the local party secretary. And that's a position that would have indeed put him in contact with Hans Modrow at the time, who indeed was being groomed to take over from Honecker. And indeed, he did for a short spell after the Berlin Wall's collapse, and he allowed sort of entities like the HVA, the Stasi's foreign intelligence arm, to sort of liquidate itself without any oversight. So there was that kind of small clue. And there was also, we can see clues in the activities of Putin's closest business ally and closest ally at the time, Matthias Warnig, who was who managed to kind of vault through the ranks of the Stasi very rapidly, and in fact become also a head of the information technology arm. And it was also clear through speaking to other Stasi officers who worked with Putin then that sort of Dresden and Putin himself were very active in smuggling technology from the West through Dresden. It was kind of, Dresden was very much a key hub for this activity. It was home to a factory called Robotron, which had already successfully cloned the IBM. And indeed, Putin, in the words of one ex-Stasi officer who later defected to the West, that Putin was working closely with Warnig on this, that Warnig was part of a cell Putin was working with, and he was running a business consultancy and trying to recruit Western scientists. And I had another break in speaking to Horst Jämlich, who is the Stasi fixer-in-chief in Dresden, and he said that indeed Putin in fact became the chief liaison officer between the KGB and the Stasi. So he wasn't the head of the KGB's Dresden station, but he was the next one on the rung below. He was the one doing the liaison with the Stasi. So these were all very interesting elements, and indeed we also saw some interesting finding clues in the German parliament's subsequent investigation of sort of Stasi activities. Then they were looking into how Dresden also became a key funnel for Stasi preparations ahead of the collapse of the communist regime, in which they were sort of essentially siphoning tens of millions of Deutschmarks through a deal to build a hard disk plant in the neighboring Thüringen. And this deal was essentially to build the most expensive plant that East Germany had ever seen, but the plant was never built, and money was siphoned through a network of companies owned by a Stasi agent called Martin Schlaf, who later appeared as a key cog in the broader Gazprom financial empire under Putin's presidency. And other people that Schlaf worked with were in turn connected with Gennady Timchenko, who we know is Putin's closest ally. And I also got hints about this from talking to Filipa Turova, the ex-KGB operative who'd worked with Putin on the oil for food deals. He also indicated that Dresden was in fact a very important hub for various sort of smuggling deals and so on. But the kind of a key question, which I got some hint at from him, was also Putin's involvement in so-called active measures, then these efforts to disrupt the West. We knew from the former Stasi officer who defected that Putin he'd spoken to a German magazine about how Putin had tried to acquire an untraceable poison from a professor, and he'd done so by trying to plant pornographic material on him that he was sort of using the art of compromat. Then we don't know whether this operation was successful or not. But this defector also told about how Putin was a handler for a notorious neo-Nazi who'd sort of gone to the West and then returned to Dresden in East Germany, where he really sparked the rise of the far right there. And then another break came when I was able to speak to a former member of the Red Army faction, and he said that actually Dresden was key precisely because it was a backwater, because it was far away from the spying eyes where all the Western forces were concentrating its attention in East Berlin. He said that members of this far left terror group would use Dresden as a meeting place, that they'd travel into East Berlin by train and from there take a ZIL car into Dresden, where they'd meet with KGB and Stasi officers, and among them Putin was the one who was leading. He said he wasn't giving orders, but they were making suggestions about possible targets and helping them acquire weapons and cash through their agents in the West. So it was a compelling picture. You know, I can't verify the former Red Army faction member's account because all the other people who he said were involved in that process are either in jail or dead. I tried to speak to Yemlish, the former Stasi officer, about this. He said, look, when it was top secret, the KGB didn't let us in. I didn't know about this, but they certainly tried to put all the blame on the Stasi. But, you know, and I also asked a senior KGB ally of Putin's about it, and his reaction was very sharp. He just said, no one has ever proved KGB's cooperation with any terror organizations in the West, and you should not try to. But in fact, there are some documents which do show the KGB was working with the Stasi, with terror groups, particularly in the Middle East, the PFLP. So this would very much be part of that same picture. Again, we only have partial sight into this, but it seemed to me that that these were all sort of credible enough and certainly fitted into a picture of activity at this time that it was definitely worthwhile reporting.
So just to push you on this a little bit, part of what I find difficult to buy is that there is no contemporaneous, like early 2000s period of Putin's rise to power when the former intelligence establishment embraces him as a, you know, like the gold medalist and, you know, pat him on the back. And I'm struck by the comment that you quoted in a piece in Politico the other day from the person that Smiley's People is about, Marcus Wolf, the former DDR Stasi spy master, or maybe I'm getting my Carré mixed up here, but is one of the preeminent figures in Cold War espionage. And he made fun of Putin at the time of Putin's rise, and says that the award that Putin got for valor to the People's Army of East Germany, they gave to the cleaning people, and it was something that only time servers would get. That it showed no particular importance. It was just an award that was handed out freely. My impression, and I'm just reflecting on my own memories of Putin's rise, is that there was always a real snobbery in the intelligence world about him, and that he was seen as someone who was, he had lucked into this job, and he was not from this, guild of accomplished intelligence officers. And then you see in his autobiography, which is written in this period, all this embellishment to try to make him seem like he was a big hotshot intelligence operative, and they're kind of gilding the lily. And now it seems 20 years later, people's memories of him and accounts have just continued to kind of build this image of him as a larger than life figure, when in fact he wasn't all that significant. And so that's still what I think sort of sticks with me is troubling, is it's easier for me to see him as someone who lucked into this and who then had any number of allies and relationships along the way. That's easier for me to see than it is that he was at the center of some important action, because it's just not, it doesn't, the contemporaneous accounts don't really mesh with that portrayal.
Yeah, I think the way that these things are not sort of mutually exclusive. Yes, he did look into it. I don't agree that his autobiography has tried in any way to gild him as a kind of a super agent. In fact, the opposite. When he was giving his interviews on the eve of his rise to the presidency, he also played down his career. He said that there was nothing really to do there. He spent so much time drinking beer that he put on all this weight, but we haven't really seen any photos of him looking particularly chubby. He himself played it down, and I'm not saying that he was he was never in the elite of the KGB, but he was certainly kind of overseeing operations which weren't on the elite end of KGB operations. They were the operations where people were actually getting their hands dirty, so it's middle echelon, but still important, and sort of certainly things that they took great efforts to cover up. And so the notion that we would take anything that Marcus Wolf said seriously is, sort of, or at face value rather than seriously, is also questionable to me, when sort of Marcus Wolf has spent his entire career previously kind of basically sort of extorting, blackmailing agents and covering things up. And also in his own career, it became clear when I was reading books about the Stasi that Marcus Wolf himself had resigned from the Stasi, I think in 86, ostensibly at the height of his career, ostensibly to write about his childhood with his brother Conrad in Moscow. Why would he do that? But it turned out, according to a very fine book and very fine, well-sourced book I read on the Stasi, that he had been in fact meeting with sort of perestroika era operatives in flats in Moscow, where they'd sort of been trying to plot this transition to a market economy along with other elements of the foreign intelligence arm, who knew time was running out for the planned economy, that they had to kind of start effecting a transition that the communist regime wasn't going to hold, and they were trying to kind of work on ways to kind of prepare themselves for the fall of the communist regime and preserve networks along the way. I don't think I ever wrote that sort of Putin was at a high level in that process, but he was certainly part of it. He was mid-level, but he was doing essentially the the job that probably higher level operatives wouldn't have wanted to be involved in, that he was sort of, he was part of a very ruthless kind of part of the KGB that was involved in active measures, or at least as far as the sources that I spoke to say. So yes, he did look in, and I think the Moscow arm of the KGB, of course, they still look down on Putin. Of course they do, and they look down on anyone from Leningrad. I spoke to one former KGB officer who, in fact, worked with people around Putin in St. Petersburg in the very early 90s, and then sort of washed his hands of dealing with them because he realized how ruthless they were. He said that these KGB guys in St. Petersburg, they sort of have an inferiority complex. They know they're the people of the second class. They're not as well educated as us types in Moscow. And because of that, they're more ruthless, and they'll do anything to hold on to power.
So let's talk about that theme in the book and connecting that ruthlessness to some of the problems that the West is confronting today. One of the theses, and again, I'll apologize if I'm oversimplifying, is that there is a kind of connection to that deep agenda that has animated Putin's power, time and power, and also that some of the tools along the way, the use of slush funds, the use of the reactivation of networks, the ability to penetrate and get access to important people in the West. That part of what you're arguing in the book is that there was a big agenda, and that Putin's time in office has been animated by some big agenda. I have often seen more accidental and more improvised patterns of behavior, rather than that, everyone sort of woke up in, I don't know, whatever day it was in 1983 and said, we have this blueprint, and then you are, all going to go implement it. And, come hell or high water, the Soviet Union collapses, there's, huge disruption, that agenda stayed intact. And I'm sort of curious, can you talk a little bit about how you came to the conclusion that there was this sort of overriding agenda, and that that Putin and his closest associates have stayed largely true to it? Can you talk about how you put that piece together, the pieces of that together?
Yeah, I think obviously a lot happens by accident, but I think certainly the Russians I speak to, everyone is very stubborn. It didn't make sense that people would just kind of give up their battle against the West just because the Soviet Union had fallen. And it was also apparent from the findings in the archives and so on, and all the conversations that I had with former KGB operatives, that there had been a push to preserve networks, that people did know that that the communist regime was essentially, it wasn't going to last. Dissent was rising. They knew that they couldn't compete against the West under a planned economy, and we can see, in fact, in some of the people that were staffing the major research institutes of the time, such as the Institute for World Economy. These were kind of individuals very much linked to foreign intelligence arm, and indeed sort of some of the former foreign intelligence KGB officers that I spoke to had also kind of basically said, yes, we knew we had to prepare this time of transition. We knew that we weren't going to be able to compete with the West. If you want to be a global empire, you have to have a large amount of money to fund it, and the Soviet Union by that time was already running on empty. So I think, nothing is ever black and white. There are always shades of gray in between. Of course, there was a lot of bumbling going on. Of course, people were stealing money. But I think there was a sense within the foreign intelligence arm and also within the economic crime unit that they had to begin to make these preparations, and indeed documents in archives do bear this up. I also spoke a very beginning from a very long time ago with two Western money men who'd worked closely with Mikhail Khodorkovsky since the end of the 80s, really as he began his rise in business. And actually part of the germ of the book came from conversations I had with them back in 2005, just after Khodorkovsky was arrested. And they too began explaining sort of how it was that there were elements in the KGB who'd sponsored the rise of sort of young entrepreneurs like Khodorkovsky, how Khodorkovsky wouldn't have been able to get anywhere in business running his cooperative without assistance from the KGB. The KGB was controlling most of the Soviet trade networks. If you wanted to export anything, you had to go through them, you had to get permission. And indeed, we saw several deals in which Khodorkovsky got access to vast amounts of cash through a nod from the director of a major scientific institute that was involved in this Russia's answer to the Star Wars program. So all these were things where he was given a helping hand from on high. And it was also the case that many of the young entrepreneurs of that era began making their way in business through importing computers. Most of these computers then were banned under Western embargoes against the import of dual-use technology into the West that could perhaps be used for military means. And most of the computer equipment Khodorkovsky was imported fell under that category. So again, this Western money man told me that he had to use KGB networks, the smuggling networks, to be able to get the computers into Russia, where of course they were able to make huge profits. So really it was this question of sort of KGB assisting the rise of the young tycoons, but then obviously when Yeltsin came to power, the young tycoons were much cleverer and sort of far more able and nimble than their former KGB masters. And in fact, Khodorkovsky himself, when I interviewed him after his release from jail in 2000, or if he was released in 2013, so I spoke to him in 2014, he himself said he was getting orders from masters, that he wasn't sort of basically in charge of his own destiny, but he would never say who the masters were. He didn't believe, in fact, that he was owner of his own business till 1993, when he suddenly realized, hey, this is mine. But by that time, they were beginning to fast eclipse their former KGB masters. They'd been given access to government accounts. We all know this story, how they then were able to leverage the government treasury funds to hugely inflate their wealth because inflation was ravaging rubles, but they were able to convert into dollars, and then they could use this money to help them privatize the country's industrial wealth. And I think this was really the moment. So the former KGB men had been in the shadows. They tried to keep control of various export networks, but obviously the young tycoons were fast outrunning them. And I did speak to sort of ex-KGB people who were involved in this process, and they talked about how the loans for shares scheme was the time that the sort of the paradigm changed. It was when they lost control, and it was also kind of basically kind of creating the seed for when they did want to take revenge. And I think that they do have, unfortunately, these very kind of Cold War reflexes hardwired into the system. So when Putin, his security man from St. Petersburg, did come to power, yes, they did represent the most ruthless clan of KGB, because they'd had to struggle far more than their Moscow counterparts. They probably didn't have quite as progressive a viewpoint as some of the Moscow group. And, and I think that they did, of course, Putin, when he first came to power, he made overtures to the West. And I think there was some space for dialogue then. And indeed, we saw him kind of opening Central Asia as a transit corridor for the US during the start of the Afghan operations following September the 11th. But he was always expecting something in return, which he never received from the US. So the US continued to treat Russia as a weaker partner. And unfortunately, sort of when your mindset is forged in the 70s and 80s, it's very difficult to kind of break from that mindset. And I think that Putin and his security men were trying to sort of take over the country's cash flows, not just to shore up their own power and line their own pockets, but because they saw it sort of as a key instrument in getting even with the West. I mean, we all remember the Khodorkovsky saga, and what Khodorkovsky was up to was also kind of potentially strategically detrimental to an aim of restoring Russia as a great power, because of course he wanted to sell control of Yukos to Exxon or Chevron. And of course, this was something, if you've grown up in the final years of the Cold War as a KGB operative, you can't even contemplate that sort of, it's just doesn't fit into your worldview, because we've all heard statements from sort of former intelligence officers or current ones where they believe that sort of America has viewed Russia as merely as a kind of a natural resource appendage that could be sort of taken over and manipulated in order to feed the West. And I think Russians, and in particular the security men, they're very proud, and there was no way that type of deal could go down. And so I've spoken to people around Putin then, and sort of others in the banking sector who had worked closely with people like Matthias Warnig and so on. And they very much described this atmosphere in which it was the security men around Putin who were persuading Putin that Khodorkovsky, for instance, posed a political challenge and this deal couldn't happen. And I think perhaps Putin in the beginning was reluctant. Perhaps he had some vestige of the more liberal outlook of his former mentor, Anatoly Sobchak, but he was more and more surrounded by the security men who, as the West ignored Putin's overtures initially as president, began to prevail in molding sort of Putin's own worldview, and in sort of helping him sort of view the economy as a tool that they could take over, not only to eliminate sort of potential political competitors like Khodorkovsky, but also sort of to take over the economy and its strategic cash flows, to eventually use that to re-establish Russia as a power, to use the stashes of cash abroad as a way to begin undermining like other Western institutions. And indeed, one former KGB officer has told me that the Russian black cash is essentially a more potent weapon than any nuclear weapon, because we can use it every day to dismantle the Western system from the inside. And I'm not saying that this was the plan from the very beginning when Putin took over the presidency, but it's certainly been an evolution that the West has played its own role in as well.
So let's pick up on a couple of those themes. On the questions of agenda, to me, I've always, every day I assume Putin wakes up and the first 20 things or 30 things that he worried about in the 20 years or so that he was in power is threats to his control and threats to the survival of the regime. And it's when there's a sense that that is threatened directly, whether it's the Orange Revolution in 2004, it's the Maidan Revolution of Dignity in 2014, the street protests in 2011, 2012, you see, this kind of intense reaction in terms of going on the offense and trying to shore up the regime. And that to me seems to be a core animating aspect of everything we can witness, whether it's disruption of the US in our election in 2016. A lot of this is sort of done in response to what the regime in Russia experienced and what it believed it was facing in terms of foreign threats. Does that come across to you in your research? Or do you see it more as what you were just describing, which is the legacy of competition with the United States and the desire to pay back when Russia was no longer a weaker country and was able to stand its ground?
Yeah, it's definitely both. I think we wouldn't have seen these kind of efforts at trying to disrupt institutions in the West had they not been sort of deeply paranoid at what they perceived as US activities in their own sphere of interest. Like, for instance, the 2004 Orange Revolution, I think that very much colored their activities. Indeed, there's a direct example of that in the book when the Kremlin was trying to determine Khodorkovsky's prison sentence. I was able to get sort of documentary evidence and an eyewitness account of how they essentially crafted Khodorkovsky's prison sentence on his appeal to make sure that he wasn't released from prison before 2008, because they feared that if Khodorkovsky was released from jail ahead of that time, then he could lead a similar Orange Revolution in Russia. They believed that sort of Khodorkovsky would then kind of turn to his former kind of allies in the US, and that this could spark a process. So I think they've been deeply paranoid that the US has been intent on encircling Russia, that it's been sort of essentially hoping to stoke its own overthrow of Putin from power in Russia. So it has very much colored their actions. So, you know, I guess it's kind of a chicken and egg issue. You know, I think things would have been different. Of course, we'd see a very different Russia today if perhaps Khodorkovsky had been allowed to sell control of Yukos to Exxon and Chevron. But of course, that didn't happen. But that didn't happen partly because the security men couldn't fathom that even happening, but also because Khodorkovsky essentially was very aggressive in the way that he dealt with the Kremlin. He didn't back down. He just kept raising the stakes even further and was openly courting the West and the US. It was almost like dangling a red rag before a bull in the way that he was kind of handling the standoffs. So, you know, he was very often traveling to meet US officials and seeking US support, even as he was diving ever deeper into conflict with the Kremlin. So, you know, it just becomes sort of a mutual process. So, and I think as well, if the Kremlin had not seen sort of US's first response to opening Central Asia as a transit corridor for US troops, the first thing the US seemed to do after that, apart from say thank you, was to withdraw unilaterally from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. We know the sort of more progressive members of the Kremlin then were shaking their head. Alexander Voloshin told me that the US still has Cold War cockroaches in its head, and it just made the kind of the more liberal, more progressive minded officials' position much harder to maintain because of the way that the US seemed to act. And we saw this reach its zenith, of course, in Putin's own speech before the Munich Security Conference in February 2007, when he was railing against how the West was ignoring all of Russia's concerns about US encroaching ever further into what Russia saw as its own sphere of interest in the near abroad, and only to be sort of greeted by sort of quite a dismissive response from the likes of Robert Gates, the US Defense Secretary at the time, who basically yawned and said, "We don't need another Cold War." And of course, you know, it's we could talk about this for forever. There are many mistakes on both sides, and I think yes, very often Putin and his security men have sort of, in some ways, they've created perceived threats from the West to help shore up their own kind of domestic agenda and domestic power. It's a good way of presenting themselves as being sort of a besieged fortress, and we must defend ourselves against the West, but it is actually also the deep-seated paranoia that the West does want to kick them out.
So let's talk about a couple of issues that are closer to my heart here in Washington, which you've reported on and that come up in the book. And there's a very funny line that a former US ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Chaz Freeman, had, which is, in the eyes of the Saudis, there are two types of people. There are Saudis and there are employees. And we've seen the Russian state assemble huge amounts of wealth, on the order of trillions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars, and buy access and respectability in the West with some of those earnings. And the latter section of your book, probably the last 20%, deals with the intersection of that success with the rise of Donald Trump. And you had done some reporting in your time, both at the FT and I also believe at Reuters, looking at some of the intersections between some of this wealth that was either siphoned off or that needed a home. It needed to be basically become normal wealth as opposed to the ill-gotten gains of the Soviet elite and then of the Putin elite. And I'm sort of curious if you could sort of tell us a bit about your conclusions. And I'd want to be very specific in what I'm going to ask. Do you believe that the Trump, corporate Trump, was just a deliberate, how do I say this, was a innocent recipient of some of that wealth flow because people bought apartments or they wanted projects that they could park money in the West? Or was there something more nefarious going on in terms of co-optation and some form of soft, either recruitment into a broader agenda, where Russian colleagues said, if you want this access to this amount of funding, you need to do things for us. I don't think you come down on that question in the book explicitly. You more just chronicle the pattern of connections. But I'm sort of curious, to what end do you think those connections were being utilized?
I don't think it's possible to say without sort of being present at the conversations, like some of these people working with Trump had, so I think probably the Trump organization was very convenient way of funneling money into the West, as you put it, parking wealth and legalizing it, whether it be through buying apartments or working on other real estate projects. He was convenient because he was a known entity to them. They'd been sort of, yes, he had been cultivated. We know that by Soviet officials since '87, when he was first invited to Moscow, where according to one former KGB officer that I did speak to, he said that the Russian KGB or the Soviet KGB then did believe that they'd recruited Trump. But I think it's definitely questionable whether that was indeed the case and whether Trump actually realized or acknowledged that he'd been recruited. But certainly on his return, what he did was music to the ears of the Soviet KGB, because he penned this open letter that was published in several major US newspapers, where he was calling for the US to rip up its global alliances with Japan and Saudi Arabia, sort of all these sort of alliances that the Soviet Union had always been so jealous of. So of course that was great for them, but I don't think they had any sort of very long-term gain that they were going to groom him to take over the US presidency. Perhaps that might have been in the dreams of some of them, because I think also Trump on his return in '87 sort of began openly contemplating a run for the presidency, and he was meeting with sort of high-level, I think, Democratic Party funders. Then he was on a different side, but that didn't go anywhere. And I presume if any Russian security official dreamed of it, they probably thought it was a pipe dream. But in the meantime, hey, here's Donald Trump, who, in the words of one of his Trump organization executives, doesn't do due diligence. So it's very convenient way to funnel money into the US, especially after 2001, after the US Patriot Act, which made it much more difficult to funnel money through the US banking system. There was a real crackdown. So high-end real estate became the new vehicle of choice. And indeed, there have been many reports by the US Treasury on how luxury real estate has really become a very convenient vehicle for funneling such funds. And but what we should look at is perhaps some of the Moscow money men who worked with Trump beginning from the early '90s and who were sort of orbiting him, have sort of it's always been the same nexus of quite loosely linked individuals, but they are individuals who do have some ties to Russian intelligence, whether it be Sheldon Chigurinsky, who I was able to speak to. He was a Moscow real estate tycoon who made his way in business in the late 80s, sort of friends with Yevgeny Primakov, the former head of Russia's foreign intelligence service, and he'd made his way first smuggling antiques and then becoming friends with people like Alfred Taubman, the chairman of Sotheby's, and sort of being introduced to Atlantic City casino operators who wanted sort of Communist Party money to be invested into Atlantic City casinos. This was back in the late 80s, and Chigurinsky said, of course that didn't happen. The US rules are far too transparent to allow that. But he did get introduced to Donald Trump, and from thenceforth there was a long and ongoing relationship. And indeed, around Chigurinsky, there's also other individuals who we know have worked closely with Trump, including Felix Sater, who worked with Trump in Bayrock and all these real estate projects in the US from 2002, 2003 onwards. And we know from Felix Sater's own admissions that he too is working quite closely with Russian intelligence, and indeed without Russian intelligence help, he wouldn't have been able to feed to US CIA and FBI information about Osama bin Laden's mobile telephones or Stinger missiles that the US had long lost in Afghanistan. And so, but I think, there are sort of certain telltale warning signs, but to say definitively that the Russians from the get-go regarded Trump as their asset, or that he was an asset, it's not possible to say. But certainly, he's implicated in some of these deals just by the fact that his organization, the Trump organization, was receiving some ill-gotten gains and helping convert it into US real estate. And, we still don't know, for instance, how much Felix Sater and Bayrock paid Trump in management fees or undisclosed license fees. That's never been disclosed. That's still an object now for discussion in the Supreme Court, how much of Trump's finances are going to be overturned to Congress. And indeed, if we ever get his tax records, will he have disclosed any of this income? We don't know. He might have given it all to his children, for instance. So I think we've still got a long way to go in terms of trying to kind of unravel this relationship. A lot to do.
So when it comes to unsolved mysteries, I've got a question from people watching on YouTube that I wanted to pass on. There's a lot of references in the book to Putin's wealth, and that, Putin owns this, or there are these funds that belong to him. I've often thought of Putin as being a person who probably doesn't even own a wallet and doesn't really, need cash or need things, because it's assumed that the country is his patrimony, and that, if he wants something, it's basically on loan to someone else, and he can have it at his, time of his own choosing. But is that your sense as well, or do you think that there are actual bank accounts that are sitting in some part of the world that have his social security number on them, and that you could freeze assets or holdings that actually belong to Putin?
No, I don't think he would ever risk putting his name to any account at all, but he does have a system of loyal allies who will provide him with whatever he needs at any time. It is a system of frontmen. I mean, we could see that, first of all, in the disclosures made by Sergei Kolesnikov, who was the St. Petersburg financier who'd worked with Putin also since the early 90s, and then began running essentially a slush fund scheme through donations for medical equipment that were diverted to make investments in Bank Recipient. And then as the wealth stash under their control grew, they began diverting some of the cash that they made from investments in Bank Recipient into building this billion-dollar palace for Putin on the Black Sea. Of course, the money in essentially the slush fund that they oversaw didn't have Putin's name on it, but we know from Kolesnikov from some of the documents that he took out from him. He also had USB sticks where he'd recorded conversations where he was talking to one of his business partners at the time, where they're talking about some money on account where they say this is Putin's money. They're saying this is Mikhail Ivanovich's money, which is the nickname they had for Putin. But of course, it wasn't held in Putin's name. It was held through this business associate who's never commented or sort of on this allegation, even though he's been asked several times. So you have a system of front people. You have whether it be sort of allies in the oil trade, for instance, or in the banking sector, such as Bank Russia. And we've seen these individuals designated by the US government in the sanctions list of 2014. I think the US government was then pretty clear about sort of the individuals they believed were kind of managing money for Putin and on behalf of him. But there's one of the sort of key things about sort of Putin. You hear, of course, all these allegations that he's the world's richest man, that he's worth hundreds of billions of dollars. But I don't think this is ever his personal money for his own personal use. It's there to essentially be used sort of whenever he needs it. But there's only so many tens of billions or even billions of dollars you can spend on mansions and yachts and so on. Essentially, this is money that, again, it's a strategic slush fund, like we saw in the St. Petersburg oil for food scheme. It's money that he can dip into for his personal needs, but it's also there for sort of the greater Russia strategic glory. It's a slush fund that they can dip into, whether it's to sort of pay off officials at home to kind of win elections or anything they need to do domestically, but it's also a slush fund that they can use, unfortunately, as we've seen, to buy and corrupt officials in the West. And unfortunately, that's quite easy to do because the amounts that Western politicians are used to dealing with are pretty much chump change for the Kremlin.
So another question from someone watching on YouTube has to do with the divisions and the competition inside Putin's entourage. And I think it's well established that most of these figures, the Putin's people that you refer to in the title, are often at each other's throats and are competing and basically animated by their dislike for each other. What's also clear, and this is sort of my add-on to the question, is that not that many people bail out, and that the benefits of being being on good terms with the leading figures in the regime far outweigh the downsides of walking away. And I'm curious, your book features a lot of accounts from people who are basically apostates or who've been totally excommunicated from Moscow ruling circles. And I'm curious what you would say to people who suggest that you're relying on the accounts of sour grapes accounts, and not on the people who've decided to stay in and basically swim in untold wealth and untold benefit from basically staying on the regime's good side.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a complex picture when deciding sort of whose account you give more weight to. Everyone has their own view of things, and very often, I mean, they people view events through their own lens. They might give themselves more importance, which is why it's important to speak to as many as people as possible. Sort of in the case, I think I had a unique opportunity in speaking to one such former member of the Kremlin Inner Circle who is very much on the outs with the Kremlin regime at the moment. That's Sergei Pugachev. We know from documents, we know from photos that have appeared on the internet that he was very close to Putin. We've seen the photographs of his teenage sons sort of hanging out with Putin's daughters at his dacha. There are also photos of Pugachev dining with Patrushev, Sechin, and Vladimir Ustinov, and Viktor Ivanov, and Tikhon Shevkunov, Putin's so-called confessor, also at Pugachev's dacha in 2005. And there were other documentary materials, some tapes that were left behind when he fled the UK, through which it was possible to corroborate his much of his account. And although you know, he is on the outs, I think in some ways it's the only way to get now a true account of Kremlin kind of dealings, and indeed of how they've operated over the years, because unfortunately the people who have stayed in, who are still part of the system, they're beholden to the people in power. There was one former banker who used to work in another very powerful bank in the 90s. This is not Pugachev, it's somebody else. He said, for instance, that Voloshin and kind of people like that, Kasyanov, are only able to be sort of critical to a certain degree, because when they lost their positions in the Kremlin, they are still part of the system, they're still in Moscow, and Putin has told them very clearly that he knows where their money is buried and where their accounts are. So they're kind of held on a certain hook, and unfortunately it's how the system works. Of course, you must speak to people like Voloshin. I was able to speak to, for instance, Valentin Yumashev. I spoke very frequently to Vladimir Yakunin, who is sort of half in, half out at the moment, but he certainly knows a great deal about sort of what happened in the 90s and probably up till quite recently. And he's visiting, or was visiting, London very often, and it was great to hear his insights. So it's very much a balancing act as to whose views that you give more prominence to. But I very much felt that sort of people like Pugachev really represented a unique opportunity that we haven't had before in really understanding the characters and the mindsets of the men around Putin. And indeed, sort of in speaking to him over many occasions and many hours, it was really possible to get a very clear and consistent picture of sort of goings on in the Kremlin.
Well, look, I hate to bring fascinating conversations to an end, but I see we've run a little bit over the allotted hour. I'm deeply grateful to you, Kathryn, for sharing all of this with us. I'm excited about the launch of the book and wish you all the best. And thanks to everyone who's been tuning in today on YouTube. Hope everyone stays safe. Thank you so much, Kathryn.
Thank you. Thanks for such great questions. It was really good to chat. Thank you.
Lovely to see you. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.